Hey everybody, this is our week 4 discussion forum review. Really diverse answers this week, interesting to read, almost difficult to narrow down some themes because you guys were noticing so many different things you were surprised by or interested in from weeks 3 and 4. Okay, but I'll do my best to try and consolidate down some of them. The first thing I want to talk about, though, has to do with one response from a student. Um, I had talked to you in previous reviews about the idea of presentism, this tendency to judge the past based on contemporary standards and expectations. And I asked you guys to try and avoid doing this. What we're trying to do is understand what 17th century, 18th century Puritan New England was really like, and not try to judge that world based on our presentist assumptions, but try to understand the world for what it was. One of my students was talking about slavery and very much trying to do what I had encouraged you guys to do was hey, try not to judge these people based on your presentist expectations. Said she was going to try not to judge Puritan attitudes towards slavery too severely because she's not from that time. Okay, this was a really thoughtful attempt. But I want to clarify something here that's really important. When we try not to use our judgments to judge the past, our presentist assumptions, that doesn't mean we can't use critiques from the time itself. And that's really important when it comes to slavery, because as long as there has been slavery, there have been critics of slavery. There have been people that thought slavery was wrong. When we get to our Enlightenment unit, which starts next week, I'm going to talk about the Quakers. And the Quakers were a Christian denomination that were very sharp critics of slavery, going back into the 1600s. I will tell you in more detail later. Often these were the first white abolitionists in America, came from Quaker backgrounds. So it's perfectly fair for us today to criticize the history of slavery precisely because during the time there were critics of slavery. Okay? If other people observed things at the time that were wrong, that they sensed were evil, that they believed were immoral, then we can also judge that because we're not using our prejudice standards. We can point to people at the time and say, look, these people, a lot of these people should have known better. Slavery was wrong. There were their contemporaries at the time that believed slavery is wrong. And so therefore, it's reasonable for us, based on their standards at the time. If there were critics of slavery back at this time, it's fair game for us to criticize slavery, okay? What this requires, however, is to know a fair amount about history, to understand the historical context. That's what we're trying to do. So I just, for those of you that might wonder, does this commitment to avoiding presentism mean that, for example, we can't criticize slavery? No. We very much can. We very much can. What we can't do is do things like criticize people for not understanding that diseases were communicable at a time in history where there was no scientific knowledge that diseases were communicable. Okay, that's unfair to judge them. We know that now because of science. But can we judge slavery? Hell yeah, we can judge slavery because there were people at the time that thought that was wrong. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. Slavery was evil and wrong and horrible And it is absolute fair game to point that out by our standards, but more specifically, by standards at the time. There were people that knew this was wrong, and we should acknowledge those people that thought slavery was wrong and evil, they were right. The slavers, they were wrong. Okay, let's get to some of these observations you were making. A lot of you were struck by the existence of Native American slavery. I'm not surprised about this. I told you. If you didn't know about this, it's not your fault. You probably never seen any of this in your history textbooks or history teachers that inform you about this. So nobody needed to feel bad about that, but I'm glad you've learned about this in this class here. A lot of you were struck by the simplicity of Puritan life when I talked about sort of their social life and their lack of possessions, which again, I'm not surprised at. We live in a very consumer-oriented society. Buying stuff is really important to a lot of people. And so to imagine a world in which there wasn't much emphasis on material possessions is intriguing. It's interesting. A lot of you were struck by our discussion of decline and how the Puritans went into decline. What was so interesting, however, about your observations is how split a lot of you were in terms of this decline. Some of you stated that you were really surprised about the decline, that you sort of you saw how solidly and seriously they tried to set up their society, and then how their utopian expectations declined so readily. Surprised you. Some of you thought it would have sustained longer, particularly after that first generation. Others of you were surprised it didn't collapse earlier. It didn't decline earlier, that this utopianism was very unrealistic, and you're surprised it lasted as long as it did. So it was fun to read different opinions on that decline, just because they were so different from one another. It was neat. Some of you were surprised by the lack of privacy in Denham and the Puritans in general. I talked about, for example, how homes tended to have few rooms. Different generations often slept together. Parents would often try to have children engage in sexual intercourse while there were other children either in the room or even in the bed with them sleeping. Some of you were quite horrified about that. But, you know, they had different expectations of privacy and propriety and realistic expectations of privacy in this world. And like I tried to emphasize in that lecture, we're the different ones. Throughout human history, a lot of societies would have been a lot more like the Puritans than like us today. We're kind of the different ones with this. But I agree with you. It's shocking to my presentist sensibilities. But again, this is one of the things that's so interesting about history, is how differently people lived their life. It's fascinating to imagine worlds that are different, really different than the world that we live in. All right? It also makes it exciting for the possibility of change in the future. Because if everything in the past was always the same as it is today, how much can things truly change? But when you start to understand how different the past could be, it opens up both exciting but also frightening possibilities of what the future can be. Things can be really different. Okay. Some of you were struck by the growing individualism of Denham that I talked about, that those of you that are reading the Lockridge book, Lockridge certainly talks about. Some of you started to recognize a Puritan world that was looking more and more like a modern America. You were seeing some of the roots of that. And finally, like I said, I could have talked about a lot of other things, but these seem to be the significant factors a lot of you were noticing. Some of you were struck by the generational differences about how sort of revered that first generation was, how respected it was, and were sometimes surprised, and some of you were even sort of disappointed that that second, that third, that fourth generation couldn't maintain that original vision. Um, but nobody in that second, third, fourth generation had the opportunity to garner that same respect that first generation did. Okay, so good job with the forum. I continue to look forward to reading your entries. Now we're going to start going to Benjamin Franklin and the Enlightenment, and so a whole new world for us to talk about. So I look forward to that.